Welcome to Entrepreneur Mind Speak. Today, we're going to be talking about money and how much money it takes to start a business. And I have Natalie here.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I'm the founder and creative director of Cloud Create Web Development, and I'm based here in Tampa.
And I'm Lauren, owner and creative director for Creme de Mint Design. We create branding and packaging for food, beauty, and supplement businesses. So today we're going to talk about how much money does it take to start a business? And one of the things I've started a business. Natalie, you've started a business. We've worked with tons of entrepreneurs that have started businesses. And I was analyzing my own business. And then I was also looking up online, like, how much does it take how much cash does it take? And I was reading that on average, it takes about $40,000 a year to run a business. And it takes about $18,000 to $60,000 a year to start a business. So if you're starting like as a solopreneur, that'll be, closer to like the $18,000. And if you're hiring some employees, that'll be closer to like $60,000. This was specifically research from Shopify, and they mostly do product businesses, which is what we're focusing on in this conversation.
Yeah, and that's e-commerce as well. So specifically, people sometimes have this idea that e-commerce, so you can start that on a shoestring budget, which it's not impossible, but you would be amazed how fast the costs stack up also for e-commerce, especially these days with how expensive everything is.
Yeah, absolutely. And a few years back, my mom and we started our own makeup line. And I think the first year it was about 25,000. And that was including the fact that I was doing all of the design. So, if we had to pay for the design, it probably would have been closer to 40,000 for us.
Totally. And especially if you are a solopreneur, and that's something that we can probably talk about a little bit more, Lauren, since we probably both have, interesting experience in regards to how we started our businesses.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, because it's not like you jump in. So we have service-based businesses, but it's the same with product-based businesses in that you're not going to start immediately just earning money right off the bat. And the good thing is with services, you do have a little bit of leverage in that way because you're not necessarily buying inventory like you do with product-based businesses, but you are then immediately having to spend your time on whatever that is. So it's a very kind of a balance that you need to have and a bit of a cushion you need to have, because the more that you can give yourself that space to really set up your business well and do the legal things that you need to do, have the inventory or the time available in order to carry everything out, you're going to need that. And you're going to be very happy with that, that you had a little bit of cushion when you actually get started in the business, because you're not necessarily, you might have $1 million e-commerce idea and it may take you 2 or 3 years to actually hit those kinds of numbers. And even then you're dealing with a fraction of the cost that's actually going into your pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. Forbes said something to the effect that it's, I think, like 3 to 4 years before businesses reach profitability. So,
wow.
Yeah. And that most businesses don't make any profit their first year in business. So, yeah.
That's like a scary idea. It's like kind of amazing that anyone has businesses. And yet, like, especially in the United States, there's so many businesses and it's so encouraged, which is honestly great, but it is scary.
Yeah, it's really scary because, about 50% of small businesses fail in the first year and 95 fail within the first 5 years, according to the SBA. That is a significant amount.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Well, we're like a country of like warriors, because I think that there's more businesses created here than anywhere else. Like I would be willing to bet on that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think like, people think that maybe it has to happen one specific way. And I think for both you and me, it wasn't one direct path. So for me, like I started having clients, I started actually freelancing first. So I would go into businesses and freelance, like I freelanced at Benihana at their corporate office. I freelanced for a few other agencies, and then I started getting my own clients. I started a group for entrepreneurs that were starting their own product lines, and I started getting my own clients and started doing that. And I tried to, just do that full time, but I ended up at one point in time, I ended up taking a full-time job and then doing it on the side until I built up clients. So it's kind of like, it's taken some time to figure it out and also to get the revenue that I wanted. And part of it, I think, is, and I think it's like this for a lot of people, is that I didn't know anything about starting a business. I didn't know like what it took. I didn't know like how to create the infrastructure for my business, how to create, there were a lot of pieces that I just hadn't learned yet. I didn't know if I should spend my time on social media or networking events or SEO or email marketing. Like, it was hard for me to figure that stuff out in the beginning. And through time and meeting other entrepreneurs, I learned those things. And I continue to learn every day. But I think that's part of why, for me, it took some time, and why I'm always trying to coach entrepreneurs that come to me with the information that I've learned, the things that I've learned, and the things I've seen work. I'm like, okay, this is a good strategy to go, because you don't want to waste your time doing this other stuff when you could be focusing over here and more likely to succeed that way.
I think that is like the best point you could possibly bring up, because that's exactly what I think 90% of entrepreneurs that start a business in one way or another, doesn't matter what kind of business, that's exactly what they run into. Because most people, they start a business not because they're natural born entrepreneurs. Some people are that way, where they just have a mind for business and they know the various different departments and they know what business needs to comprise of, and they have a mind for that. But most people that start businesses are not in that category. Most people, for example, when I, have some kind of product-based business and they have some, beautiful item or interesting item that they want to sell, this is something that came out of their mind that they're specifically interested in, and they wanted to make a product to facilitate that interest. And they might be complete experts in that area. For example, like a recent client that had, they made cookies. They made fantastic cookies, and they knew everything about cookies and everything about the cookie industry and everything about manufacturing and their factory and all these things. But they didn't know about marketing. They didn't know about, like, okay, how many emails do you send out? How do you set up your website so that it actually converts? How do you set up any funnels you're doing? How do you, do even the accounting side? Like, all of the parts that fit into a business that actually make it a business versus just something that you're doing as a hobby. Those are things that you have to learn, and you need to take that into account when you're also thinking about financially going into a space. And you're basically, no matter how expert you are, you're going into the deep end, and you're going to have to swim, and you're going to have to make it all go. But you don't know what you don't know yet until you actually jump in.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how much you don't know until you jump in. And I found that even though I had my design business for several years, when I did create a project business with my mom, there were a bunch of things that I didn't know until I was doing that. And then I ran across them and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I didn't consider this, I didn't consider that. There were just things that until you're in it, you don't really know it as well as you think you do sometimes.
Totally.
Yeah. And like, before I had my own design business, I worked for a large corporation. And in the large corporation, I was just doing one little piece of the puzzle, which I knew very, very well. But there are all these other pieces that when you're working with small businesses, they struggle with.
Yes.
And they'll ask you for help with. So it's something I've learned over the years for sure. And like I said, still learning. But I was reading recently that the most common reason small businesses fail are capital, like lack of funding, retaining an adequate management team, an infrastructure, like a faulty infrastructure or business model, and unsuccessful marketing initiatives. So,
wow.
yeah,
Oh my God, that just reminds me of the unsuccessful business model that you mentioned. I think that it's an interesting subject right now, because it really also depends when you're doing these kinds of business models and what's going to work depending on the time. For example, in the time where the interest rates were very, very low, doing business models where you're spending an exorbitant amount in marketing, so you're selling at a little bit of a loss because you're just getting your product out there, that was okay, because borrowing money was so cheap. So you could borrow the money for almost nothing and then just pay it back over time as the company became profitable. But that kind of business model is probably not going to work as well going into the future. Companies really have to think with like, okay, how do I get my business profitable as fast as humanly possible? Because the infinite supply of money is just like, I mean, it's still pretty infinite probably, but it's a little bit less infinite than it was.
I was wondering, like, how do people fund their businesses? Because I often get asked that question, like, someone will ask me, like, do you know an angel investor? Do you know a venture capitalist? Like, they ask me these type of questions. Most of the people, 66% of the people, they get it through personal savings, like their own money. So, maybe they have a full-time job and they're helping finance their business through that way, or they may get financial support from friends or family. Right. That's about 23% of people do that. 21% of people get personal loans, which is not a lot.
Yeah.
People are using their own savings. And then lastly, reinvesting sales revenue, that's about 30%.
Having that foresight and thinking about this stuff, especially with all these numbers you're talking about, I think is really important, because I bet that a lot of these people that are funding it with their own savings and funding it, and I know this even happened to me on occasion, funding it through savings and stuff, or even taking out loans and things like that. I feel like that's often for things that they didn't expect ahead of time, or certain bills that came up or certain expenses that they weren't foreseeing. And all of a sudden they're in the situation where they have this business, they need to keep it going. Okay, cool. Well, what else are you going to do? I guess we'll pull it out of savings, or I guess we'll pull it out of a loan or whatever. So it's not necessarily bad, but it's definitely good to think with, like, if you're starting a business, know that there's going to be money going into it, even if it seems like there wouldn't be, even if you think you have a strategy worked out where, you won't need too much capital. It's still a good idea to know that, okay, you have this little cushion or whatever, and it's going to be okay if you need to use it.
Yeah. So when I had my product business with my mom, we did get a loan. So we had some of our own personal money. And then on top of it, we got a personal loan through the business.
Right.
And that was partly through the bank and partly through SBA, which was great. And we got a really good rate. But it was one of those type of loans that if you don't pay it back, they can come and garnish your wages. They can come. And, there's all sorts. I've read all sorts of horror stories. So you have to pay it back.
Yes.
You can't just do claim bankruptcy or something.
Wow, that's interesting.
That way. So getting loans is great, but it's really tricky because you do have to pay it back. And so we did some stuff we had a line of credit that was our loan, and then we also had our credit cards as well. And so it's definitely, it's challenging, and figuring out all the expenses, especially, for small businesses, like they don't always realize like what types of costs they're going to run into. So it's really important to create like a spreadsheet or something where you have your ongoing costs and you have your startup costs, and you add all of that up and look online to see what your business is, and see if there might be some costs that you might have forgotten. So you make sure you get everything in there. A lot of people that a lot of people miss things like shipping costs and the amount of, like, one of the things that happens a lot these days is people return items. So they return
Yes.
items, and you don't expect, like, okay, they're going to return it. You're going to have to pay for the return shipping, or you can have your client, you can have your customer pay for it. But it can get tricky. Like, how much do you want to charge the customer? Because if they buy your product and they are not like happy with it, you want to be able to refund their money if they're not happy, right?
Right.
Then you're having them ship it back. You probably can't use that product again, depending on what it is. And so you have these damaged and returned items and shipping fees. And before you know it, like, that's really, it adds up so much,
All of a
especially.
sudden your profit margin
Yeah.
is gone. Like,
Mhm.
you can be dealing with profit margin as small often in product-based businesses that having an additional shipping fee or restocking fee or whatever can wipe that out. So that's such a good point. People need to be really aware of what to do with returns. And you might have to be that company, especially in the beginning, that charges people to send the products back, because that can be an issue for sure.
Yeah, but I think there's also hesitation for new customers to buy from you if they feel like it's
True.
difficult. So it's kind of tricky. And I think the other area that people don't always think about is, like, say that you're creating a new product and you have to do product testing. So if you want like a specific type of packaging, and say that your manufacturer hasn't tested that product inside, like, say for example, it's a skincare product and they haven't tested it inside of that container, you're going to have to do you're going to have to test it and make sure that there's not going to be any issues, because if there is, then you could also start having returns there as well. So it can, the bills can really rack up quickly if you're not careful about these things.
Yeah, and I think that as like a solution to all of this, because obviously, like, this whole country, in my opinion, is based on entrepreneurship, and it's based on people taking these risks. And I honestly, that's why I even stayed in the United States, having moved here from the Netherlands, was because of the entrepreneurial spirit that people have, and how to kind of offset the risk that people run into when they're creating a business. I believe, and I've seen this work very successfully, is just to make sure, like, take each stage of the business as its own stage and make sure that you really test everything, like you're saying, really well on all the stages. So for example, you get an idea, you have a bright idea for some new product, test it first, maybe call some friends, maybe call some acquaintances, and just talk about the idea as the first thing. See how it gets, how other people respond to it. Does it sound interesting? Does it sound like something they're willing to buy? Okay, cool. It sounds like something they're willing to buy. Maybe have a prototype made. And like, you kind of like inch your way every stage, and make sure that you have that product market fit by the time that you're actually launching an e-commerce store and you're fully wanting to distribute the product out into the world. Because if you do those stages, you're going to be a lot more confident by the time you have your real product that you're willing to invest in the inventory on, and you're willing to invest in the marketing on, and like, it's no doubt that it's going to succeed, even if you have to, change around the marketing and you change your messaging and your wording or whatever. If you know your product is really, really good and you have that confidence, that will make it so much easier in order to push through those barriers.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, addressing a pain point, a consumer pain point, is a key way to do that. A lot of times, entrepreneurs, they're starting a product line because they had some pain point, or they had a passion for something specific. But oftentimes it's like a pain point. They had a pain point and they thought, well, let me try to find this in the market. They couldn't find it in the market. So they're like, I'm going to create it.
Yes.
So if you can see that other people are also struggling with this same pain point, then you probably have like a really good niche. And having a niche is so important for profitability, because if you have a niche, you'll be able to get dedicated customers
Right.
to buy your product because you're speaking to that specific demographic.
Right. Yeah. And you want to make sure to, research all of that really well. You don't want to come up with a product and want to charge $50 for it. And you find out on Amazon, they're selling the exact same thing for $10 and you have no differentiating factor. Things like this is all stuff that you really want to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely doing your competitive research is key to a successful product. One of the things I've seen many product businesses do, especially food businesses, is that they test it out at like a little farmer's market. And
Right.
then you
Yes.
can have like people trying it. You can see their reaction. You can tweak it. You can see like, okay, is this something that people actually want? And how much are they willing to pay? And understanding that market, that benchmark, that market, what the market will hold.
Yeah.
That's super important. Now, there's another piece that I think sometimes entrepreneurs don't think about is it also depends on how it's presented. So if you have a product that's presented in one way visually, people may be less willing to buy that product at a premium price than if it's designed in another way. And that's where, that's where we come in with package design, is to help with that. So I think it's important to make sure that you're making a product that people want, but then also keep in mind that if you're targeting a specific consumer, you want to make sure that that consumer is being reached through the communication of your packaging.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the messaging of the product and the positioning of the product. So the product is really the first step to make sure you have a good product. And then it's the next thing of like, okay, how do you imbue this with the life that you want it to have in order for it to reach the right people that are also going to be willing to pay the right price for it. So it's really true. It's like a whole slew of various different problems that you have to look at and be willing to solve. And oh my God, I feel like if people would know to look at this roadmap before starting, but start immediately, but just know that this roadmap exists, that would already save so much trouble for many businesses that are just jumping out there ready to go. And they might accidentally be jumping in the wrong direction or doing it in the wrong order, and therefore having more trouble than they expect.
Yeah, you definitely want to start with the end in mind. So you want to have an idea of like, okay, this is the plan. This is what I'm looking to do. Organize like what you want for your business, both financially, what you want your life to look like with the business. You want to take everything into account, and even thinking about like how you're going to exit your business.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a weird thing to think about when you're first starting your business, but you don't want to end up in a situation where you have this massive line of credit that you have to pay back and you can't pay it back, and then your house is on the line or something like that. So you want to think about, okay, like what's my exit strategy if things go right, and what's my exit strategy if things go wrong?
There was one story of this lady. She actually ended up on Shark Tank. That's just how I saw this. But it was a woman, I believe she was selling cookies also. And it was like a homemade recipe that she really loved, and they were really good. And she was one of those that ended up walking out of Shark Tank without any deal. Because she had gone massively into debt. Like, this was a woman that had been making a lot of money at a previous job, had invested, I think in the end, $2 million between all her savings, her 401k, and her home. She had like a $400,000 home, and she took all the equity out of it and put it into this business, to the point where the margins she was making on these cookie sales were never going to be enough. Like the timeline in order for that business to become profitable was so long. And this was a woman that was already older, that she was going to have to make a serious pivot and come up with some insanely creative way of like selling a record amount of cookies in order to ever get out of that hole. And in order for any investor to ever be willing to take on that business or be a part of that business. And it was kind of heartbreaking because she really just put everything into this thing. And that willingness to put everything in ended up being a liability, because instead of finding other ways of getting the product out without having to spend more money on it, and like, you know, having that kind of like entrepreneurial problem solving mindset, she was just dumping more and more money in. And unfortunately, that led her business to have a lot of struggles for that. And I don't know where they ended up now. Hopefully they came up with some creative solution, but I know that that would have been really hard to get out of.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah, I think that remaining flexible and being willing to pivot is so important. And if you
Yeah.
see like one strategy is working, maybe you can continue with that strategy. If you see that another strategy isn't working, maybe pull back and come up with a different strategy. Like in my business, I have a few different strategies working at the same time. So I have email marketing strategy, which is helping to retain customers. I have my networking strategy, you know, through different like groups that I'm running, approaching it from different ways. So I think the same thing with a product business. You want to approach it in different ways. You want to work with influencers. You want to do little pop-up shows or pop-up parties or events of some sort. You want to see all the different avenues. And maybe there's an avenue that you've thought of that somebody else hasn't. Maybe you're partnering with a different type of business and you're creating like this new excitement for both businesses by partnering with that business. So coming up with these different creative strategies can help you with that cash flow.
Totally. I think creativity is like the perfect word in that, because it's just like constantly creating on your business rather than having a business and just trying to roll with one thing that might work in the beginning. I see a lot of in our industry, but for example, in designers and developers, how you got a client, your first ever client, does not mean that that's the best way to get a client and that you're going to keep getting clients like that forever. And there was one designer actually who became a very successful product designer. He said something that I thought was funny. He said, you know, when you were a kid, you were given pocket money by your parents. That doesn't mean that like everyone in the world is going to give you pocket money and you're just going to like make a ton of money that way. You need to solidify any kind of lines that you have that bring income and then keep adding and keep trying. And that's how you'll expand. And that applies to service businesses, but also definitely to product-based businesses. Just because you have your Facebook ads are working really well 1 month, that doesn't mean that you can completely not do, you know, your organic social media or leave your website unchanged or whatever. You need to continuously create on new avenues.
Yeah, I think it's continuously create on new avenues and diversify to some degree, not to the point where you can't manage it, but having some diversification is always a great financial strategy.
I hope that this left people more inspired and more educated to create their businesses, not scared to start one. Definitely start whatever you're going to start, but just know these things so that you can be prepared.
I think that wraps up our session today, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about money mindset. So stay tuned.